The most significant seismic story of this week was not in Japan. It was not near Tokyo or along the Tohoku coast. It was underneath the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States, and almost nobody in the global media was talking about it. While every camera crew on Earth was pointing at Hokkaido, the United States Geological Survey was quietly recording something that seismologists along the American West Coast have been watching with increasing unease for months. A magnitude 6.1 earthquake off the coast of Oregon, a 4.9 aftershock sequence beneath the seafloor west of Newport, and a cluster of microseismic events registering beneath the southern Washington Cascades at depths that tell a very specific and very unwelcome story about stress accumulating along the most dangerous fault system on the North American continent. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever personally felt an earthquake, even a small one, and found yourself unable to stop thinking about where you were standing and what would have happened if it had been bigger? Tell me where you were and what that felt like. If you want to be the first to know every time something like this develops, subscribe. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm gets it in front of people who need to see it. Today we are going to break down exactly what happened this week, why the Cascadia Subduction Zone changes everything about the comparison with Japan, and whether America is genuinely prepared for what the USGS says is not a question of if but when. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened this week, you need to understand what the world was watching and what the world was not watching at the same time. On June 14th, 2026, at 2:47 in the morning local time, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck approximately 60 miles off the coast of Hokkaido, Japan. The Japan Meteorological Agency issued a tsunami warning within 90 seconds of the event. Shinkansen bullet train networks across the Tohoku and Hokkaido regions automatically halted within 8 seconds of the shaking, triggered by the seismic early warning sensors installed across Japan's national rail system. Coastal evacuation sirens activated in 34 municipalities within 120 seconds. Japanese national broadcaster NHK was carrying live coverage before the first major aftershock. The global media response was immediate and total. By the time the earthquake had finished shaking, live footage was already running on 6 continents. The Japanese government had a complete command and control structure fully activated within 9 minutes of the initial event. The Hokkaido earthquake caused significant structural damage to approximately 300 buildings in coastal communities. It triggered a tsunami that reached heights of 1.4 meters at the town of Aramo and 2.1 meters at the port of Muroran. 47 people sustained injuries. Remarkably, there were 0 fatalities. That outcome, 0 deaths in a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, is not an accident, and it is not luck. It is the product of decades of national investment in earthquake engineering, early warning infrastructure, public education, and building codes that in many cases require wooden residential structures to withstand shaking that would level comparable buildings on the American West Coast. Japan spends billions of dollars per year on seismic preparedness, and on June 14th, that investment paid for itself in human lives. That changed fast. While the Hokkaido earthquake dominated every major international news feed, the United States Geological Survey's automatic detection systems were simultaneously flagging a sequence of events along the American West Coast that received almost no mainstream coverage at all. At 11:22 in the morning Pacific time on June 14th, 9 hours after the Hokkaido event, a magnitude 6.1 earthquake struck the Cascadia Subduction Zone 48 miles west-northwest of Newport, Oregon. The depth was 14 kilometers. To put that in context, shallow earthquakes, those occurring above 30 kilometers, transmit a significantly higher proportion of their energy to the surface. At 14 kilometers, a 6.1 is not a minor event. It is a strong, energy-loaded shock capable of causing significant damage to older or unreinforced structures within 60 miles of the epicenter. The earthquake was felt from Northern California to the Portland metropolitan area. Residents in Newport, Lincoln City, and Tillamook reported objects falling from shelves, cracks forming in plaster walls, and the distinct rolling motion that coastal Oregon residents recognize as a sign of a deep offshore source. The Shake Alert Early Warning System, the Pacific Coast's Earthquake Alert Network, delivered a warning to users in coastal Oregon communities an average of 11 seconds before the shaking arrived. In a Cascadia Subduction Zone scenario, 11 seconds is the difference between standing in a doorway and being buried under a collapsed ceiling. But here is the part that USGS seismologists were watching far more carefully than the earthquake itself. Between June 14th and June 19th, a sequence of 43 smaller earthquakes, ranging from magnitude 1.8 to 4.9, registered at depths between 8 and 22 kilometers along the same section of the Cascadia Subduction Zone plate interface. 43 events in 5 days along a single fault segment. The USGS Earthquake Hazards Program flagged the sequence in an internal advisory note to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, describing the clustering as consistent with stress redistribution along a locked fault segment that last ruptured in January of 1700, 326 years ago. And the USGS's own probabilistic hazard models place the likelihood of a Cascadia magnitude 8 or greater earthquake within the next 50 years at approximately 14%. That number does not sound alarming until you understand what a Cascadia magnitude 8 or greater means for the 7 million people living in its impact zone. By the time the final aftershock from the June 14th sequence had been recorded on June 22nd, the global media had moved on entirely. The Japan earthquake was already yesterday's story. The Oregon sequence was never today's. Now let us explain exactly what the Cascadia Subduction Zone is, why it sits in a category of seismic danger almost entirely separate from the kind of earthquake California or Japan experiences on a routine basis, and why the week of June 14th crystallized something that Pacific Northwest seismologists have been warning about for the better part of 40 years. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is the boundary where the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate is being forced beneath the North American plate along a fault line stretching approximately 1,000 kilometers from Northern California through all of Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, Canada. The rate of subduction, the speed at which the Juan de Fuca plate dives beneath North America, is approximately 40 millimeters per year. That is roughly the same speed at which a human fingernail grows. It does not sound like much until you account for the fact that at this interface, two enormous sections of the Earth's crust are locked together by friction. The Juan de Fuca plate wants to move. The North American plate is holding it back. Every year that passes without a release event is another year of accumulated elastic strain energy loading into the fault interface. To put the scale of that energy in context, the Cascadia fault interface extends from the surface down to approximately 25 kilometers depth and spans more than 1,000 kilometers of coastline. When it finally releases. And it will release, because every locked subduction zone in the geological record eventually does. The energy will not be released from a single point. It will rupture along hundreds of kilometers of fault simultaneously. The last time this happened was at 9 o'clock in the evening on January 26, 1700. Native oral histories along the Pacific Northwest coast recorded a catastrophic event. Japanese historical records preserved the exact arrival time of the tsunami that crossed the Pacific and reached the coast of Honshu 8 to 9 hours later. Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring records, confirmed the date of simultaneous death of coastal forests in Washington and Oregon, drowned when the seafloor subsided by as much as 2 meters in the minutes following the rupture. That event was estimated at magnitude 9 or greater. A full margin Cascadia rupture. If you follow Pacific Northwest seismic research at all, the name The Really Big One probably already rings a bell. Popularized by a 2015 New Yorker article by Catherine Schultz that remains the most widely read earthquake preparedness piece in American journalism history. The central thesis of that article is not disputed by USGS or university seismologists. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is capable of producing a magnitude 9.0 or greater earthquake. The evidence is in the geological record. The question has never been whether the fault can do it. The question is when. There is a broader context that explains why the Pacific Northwest is not simply another version of California or Japan when it comes to seismic risk. And understanding it requires stepping back from the Cascadia Zone itself to look at the Ring of Fire as a complete system. The Ring of Fire is the term geologists use to describe the chain of subduction zones, tectonic boundaries, and volcanic arcs that encircle roughly 90% of the Pacific Ocean. It stretches from the tip of South America northward through California, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, New Zealand, and back to South America. Approximately 90% of all earthquakes on Earth occur along the Ring of Fire. More than 75% of all active volcanoes are associated with it. The reason is straightforward. The Pacific Ocean is underlain by oceanic crust that is denser and thinner than continental crust, and where it meets the continents surrounding the Pacific, it subducts, sinks beneath the lighter continental rock. Every subduction zone on the ring is a factory for seismic energy. Japan sits directly on the western margin of the Ring of Fire, above the subduction boundary where the Pacific Plate descends beneath the Eurasian Plate. The United States Pacific Northwest sits on the eastern margin, above the Cascadia subduction boundary. They are both Ring of Fire nations. They are both subduction zone societies. The difference between them is not geological position. It is 100 years of investment response time. Japan has been building its earthquake response infrastructure since the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. The Pacific Northwest has been building its Cascadia awareness only since the 1980s, when the geological evidence for a past magnitude 9 event was first assembled from the scientific record. The key distinction in earthquake type also matters here. Not all earthquakes along the Ring of Fire are the same. Japan's June 14th event, a magnitude 7.8 generated by a relatively contained fault segment, is what seismologists classify as an interplate earthquake on a strike slip or reverse fault. It is damaging and serious, but it originates from a limited source area. A full margin Cascadia rupture is a megathrust earthquake, a simultaneous failure along the entire locked interface, not just one segment. The closest comparable event in recorded modern history is the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, which ruptured approximately 1,300 kilometers of the Sunda Subduction Zone off Sumatra at magnitude 9.1 and generated a tsunami that killed over 200,000 people across 14 countries. Cascadia's fault length is comparable. Its population proximity to the coast in some areas is worse, and it has been locked without a full release for 326 years. But here is the distinction that makes Cascadia categorically different from the kind of seismic event the world watched in Japan on June 14th. Japan's June 14th earthquake was generated by a strike slip and compressional mechanism off the coast of Hokkaido. A damaging event, absolutely, but one originating from a specific and geographically limited fault segment. The Cascadia scenario is a full margin subduction zone rupture. These are not comparable events. A Cascadia magnitude 9 would release approximately 31 times more energy than the Hokkaido 7.8. It would generate ground shaking simultaneously across all of Oregon, all of western Washington, and portions of northern California and British Columbia. And it would trigger a tsunami that, according to USGS and NOAA modeling, would reach the Oregon and Washington coastlines in 15 to 30 minutes. In some locations, faster. The Hokkaido event triggered a 1.4 meter tsunami. The Cascadia event, in historical accounts and geological proxies from 1700, sent a wave that inundated coastal zones with flooding depths estimated at 10 to 15 meters or more in some locations. These are not just geological events. They are human experiences. And the human experience of Cascadia versus Japan involves a gap in preparedness that seismologists describe carefully and consistently as the most consequential disaster readiness shortfall in the United States. Japan has installed more than 4,000 seismic sensors across its national territory. The Shake Alert system deployed across California, Oregon, and Washington operates on approximately 1,500 sensors. Japan's building codes for earthquake resistance in coastal zones are among the most stringent in the world. Oregon and Washington have a significant percentage of building stock, schools, hospitals, bridges, highway overpasses, that seismic engineers have flagged as vulnerable to collapse under ground shaking levels that a Cascadia event would produce far inland, not just on the coast. In 2013, Oregon's Seismic Safety Policy Advisory Commission published a report describing the anticipated impacts of a Cascadia rupture as, in their words, the most severe natural disaster Oregon has ever faced. That report estimated that a full margin Cascadia event could produce 10,000 deaths in Oregon alone. Those are the state's own projections. The contrast between Japan's June 14th response and what those numbers imply for the Pacific Northwest is not a rebuke of American emergency management professionals, many of whom are doing extraordinary work with the resources they have. It is a reflection of a gap that developed over decades of policy attention directed toward other threat categories. Japan has been rebuilding its seismic infrastructure continuously since the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake killed over 100,000 people. The Pacific Northwest has not experienced a magnitude 9 earthquake in the era of modern infrastructure. The absence of the event created the absence of urgency. The absence of urgency created the gap that the week of June 14th made visible to anyone paying attention. There is also a fundamental data question about how many people in the Pacific Northwest are actually prepared for any of this. FEMA conducts an annual national household survey on disaster preparedness. The most recent survey found that fewer than 40% of Americans living in high seismic risk zones report having an earthquake emergency kit assembled in their home. Fewer than 35% report having identified their nearest evacuation route for a tsunami or other local hazard. When broken down by coastal Pacific Northwest counties, the preparedness rates track closely with the national averages, which means that somewhere between 60 and 65% of the households in Cascadia's most vulnerable coastal zone have not taken the basic pre-event actions that emergency managers consistently identify as life-saving. Japan's equivalent survey numbers are essentially the inverse. In communities that experienced the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, post-event surveys found that well over 80% of residents had pre-identified evacuation routes and assembly points. The difference between those numbers is not culture alone. It is what happens when a society absorbs a catastrophic event and institutionalizes the response through school curricula, community drills, and mandatory emergency education at the local government level. Shake Alert's deployment history is worth understanding in this context, because it illustrates the pace at which preparedness infrastructure tends to be built in the United States. The Shake Alert project was first proposed in research form in the early 2000s. Funding for a pilot system in California was approved in 2012. Full public alerting in California was launched in 2019. Oregon and Washington were added in 2021. The complete Pacific Coast build-out, from concept to all 3 states operational, took approximately 2 decades. Japan's current seismic monitoring network, by comparison, has been continuously expanded and upgraded since the 1920s. The comparison is not meant as a criticism of the engineers and scientists who built Shake Alert. It is a world-class early warning system, and it will save lives in the Oregon offshore earthquake scenario. It is meant to illustrate the timeline challenge. Cascadia Preparedness is a generational project, and the generation in which the earthquake arrives may not be the generation that completed all the necessary work. The Shake Alert system, to its credit, performed exactly as designed during the June 14th Oregon event. Its 11-second average warning time before shaking arrived in coastal communities is real, it is valuable, and it saved people from physical harm in the immediate event. But seismologists are consistent on this point. For a full margin Cascadia rupture, Shake Alert warning times for communities directly above the rupture zone would be effectively 0. If you are standing in Newport, Oregon, or Seaside, Oregon when the Cascadia fault breaks, the shaking and the ground subsidence will arrive before any electronic warning can reach you. The warning system was designed for distant earthquakes. Cascadia does not give you distance. You are on top of it. What scientists are monitoring right now, in direct response to the June 14th sequence, is a signal that Pacific Northwest seismologists describe as episodic tremor and slip. A slow, quiet movement of the plate interface that occurs at regular intervals of roughly 14 months along the Cascadia zone. Episodic tremor and slip events do not generate felt earthquakes. They are measured only by ultra-sensitive borehole strainmeters and GPS displacement sensors embedded in the crust. But they load stress onto the locked, shallow portion of the fault, the segment that generates the large earthquakes. The most recent episodic tremor and slip event beneath northern Washington registered in April of 2026, 2 months before the June 14th sequence. Keep an eye on the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network's monthly tremor bulletins. Those updates are the closest thing seismologists have to a pulse reading for the Cascadia Fault's current stress state. What is also being watched closely is the connection between Cascadia seismicity and the active volcanic arc that runs parallel to it. Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and Mount Hood all sit above the zone where the subducting Juan de Fuca plate releases water and fluids into the overlying mantle, driving the volcanism. The shallow earthquake swarm recorded beneath the southern Washington Cascades between June 15th and June 19th does not indicate an imminent volcanic eruption. Scientists currently have no evidence that any of the arc volcanoes are moving toward eruptive activity. But the swarm is consistent with the kind of seismic noise that the USGS Volcano Hazards Program monitors precisely because a Cascadia megathrust event and a volcanic response are not separate scenarios in the geological record. In 1700, there is stratigraphic evidence of increased volcanic activity in the years immediately following the last great Cascadia rupture. These are connected systems, what the Pacific Northwest does have, and what deserves to be stated clearly rather than buried, is a growing and increasingly serious preparedness ecosystem. The Cascadia Subduction Zone Earthquake and Tsunami Operational Response Plan, developed jointly by FEMA, the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, and the Washington Military Department, is one of the most detailed disaster response pre-plans for a single geological scenario in American history. It pre-assigns mutual aid responsibilities, pre-positions supplies, pre-designates airspace corridors for rescue helicopter operations, and pre-plans the logistical sequence of the first 72 hours after a Cascadia rupture. Oregon's Project Safe Haven program has identified hundreds of locations across the state that could serve as assembly points and aid stations in the first weeks after an event. The Federal Highway Administration has funded seismic retrofits on critical bridges across the I-5 and I-90 corridors specifically because those routes are the primary arteries for moving emergency response resources into the impact zone after a Cascadia event severed coastal access. This work is real, it is funded, and it is ongoing. The gap between current preparedness and the scenario's demands is not being ignored. It is being reduced year by year, grant by grant, bridge by bridge. But the pace of the reduction is in a race with the pace of the fault's accumulating strain, and the fault does not wait for the preparedness plan to be complete. The most recent FEMA-funded study of post-Cascadia life for the Pacific Northwest communities west of Interstate 5, conducted by a multi-university research consortium and released in 2024, concluded that the most significant preparedness deficiency is not the response infrastructure, which is improving steadily, but the basic household and community-level readiness that determines How many people survive the first 72 hours before formal response arrives? The study found that in a full margin Cascadia rupture, an estimated 40 to 50% of coastal Pacific Northwest communities would be effectively isolated from outside emergency response for 3 to 7 days due to road damage, bridge failures, and the tsunami inundation of coastal access routes. In that window, the households and communities that are self-sufficient, with water, food, medical supplies, and a shelter plan, survive at dramatically higher rates than those without those preparations. And then there is the earthquake risk category that receives almost no public attention at all, despite covering the most populated agricultural heartland of the United States. The New Madrid Seismic Zone runs through southeastern Missouri, northeastern Arkansas, western Tennessee, and southern Illinois. In the winter of 1811 to 1812, a sequence of 3 earthquakes estimated at magnitude 7.5 to 8.0 struck the region. They were felt across 1 million square miles of the North American continent. Reports of shaking reached the East Coast. The Mississippi River temporarily ran backward in places due to ground deformation. The town of New Madrid, Missouri, was largely destroyed. 12 million Americans now live within the seismic hazard zone of the New Madrid system. The USGS estimates a 10% probability of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake in that zone within the next 50 years. And the building stock across the Mid-South and Midwest affected by that system was not designed to any meaningful seismic standard. The contrast with the Pacific coast is significant. But both face risk that the global media conversation, focused entirely on Japan on the week of June 14th, left entirely unaddressed. Here's where the science leaves us, and we have to be precise about what it actually says. Is the week of June 14th evidence that Cascadia is about to rupture? No. Scientists do not have evidence supporting that conclusion, and the science of subduction zone seismicity does not work on timelines that a single 5-day earthquake sequence can narrow. A cluster of offshore events along a locked fault segment can represent elevated stress. It can also represent routine accommodation of plate motion that happens constantly without a large event following. The USGS 14% probability estimate for a Cascadia magnitude 8 or greater in 50 years is not 0, but it is also not a prediction. It is a probability calculated from the geological record of rupture intervals over thousands of years. What scientists are saying, clearly and without hedging, is this. The Pacific Northwest will experience a Cascadia magnitude 8 or greater earthquake. It is not a question of if. It is a question of when, and of how prepared the 7 million people in the impact zone are when it happens. The June 14th Oregon offshore sequence did not answer that question, but it pointed at it while every camera in the world was looking the other way. The most dangerous seismic story of the week of June 14th, 2026 was not in Hokkaido. It was off the coast of Oregon. It was underneath the Cascades, and it is still there right now, building, slowly, at 40 millimeters per year. If you are in coastal Oregon, coastal Washington, or the greater Portland or Seattle metropolitan areas, your earthquake preparedness plan is not something to defer. Knowing where your nearest high-ground tsunami evacuation route is located is not paranoia. It is the same investment and outcome that Japan made for a century before June 14th, and it is the reason the camera crews that went to Hokkaido had almost nothing catastrophic to film. Drop a comment and tell me, did you feel the June 14th Oregon earthquake? Or do you live in the Pacific Northwest and think about Cascadia? Tell me what your current plan is. And let us go for 5,000 likes so this video reaches the people in the actual hazard zone who need to see it. See you in the next one.